There was a time, not long ago, when the village of Marrowvale stood beneath a sky that always seemed to hold secrets. The clouds, thick and heavy, hung low as though the heavens themselves were keeping something from the earth. The village was small, almost forgotten, nestled in the shadow of a forest that no one dared enter. The people spoke of it in hushed tones, for there were stories of a song that was never written, a melody that had been lost to time. Lena Whitford, a young woman with an insatiable curiosity, moved to Marrowvale in the spring of her life. She was drawn to the village not by any particular reason, but by a compulsion she could not explain. Perhaps it was the pull of the unknown, the faint echo of a melody she couldn't quite hear but somehow felt deep within her bones. Lena had always been drawn to music. Not in the conventional sense, she was not a performer or a composer, but in the way that music seemed to speak to her soul. She could hear melodies in the wind, in the rustle of leaves, and in the distant hum of the village clock tower. It was as though the world itself had a song, one that only she could hear. On her first day in the village, she visited the town square, where an old stone fountain stood at the center, its waters long since dried. The fountain was surrounded by the crumbling remains of buildings, as if the village had once been larger but had been forgotten by time. It was here, near the fountain, that she met a peculiar man, an elderly figure who appeared as though he had lived in Marrowvale for centuries. His name was Ezra Finch, and he was known by the villagers as a keeper of stories, a man who could weave tales that felt like more than just words. "Ah, a stranger," Ezra said, his voice gravelly, yet warm. "You've come seeking something, haven't you?" Lena, a little taken aback by the directness of the question, nodded. "I suppose I have," she said softly. "I feel as though there is something here that I need to find." Ezra's eyes narrowed, the wrinkles on his face deepening. "It is always the ones who seek the unknown who find it. Be careful what you listen to in this village, young one. For there is a song here, a song that was never written. A song that lives between the notes, just out of reach." Lena's heart skipped a beat. A song that was never written. She had heard rumors of such a thing, whispers of a melody that could change everything. Some said it was a curse, others claimed it was a gift. But no one had ever dared to speak of it openly, not until now. "What do you mean?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra looked at her with a knowing expression. "The song that was never written is not meant to be heard by all. But I see it in your eyes. You are one of the few who might understand it. You may not find it easily, but you will find it nonetheless." With that, the old man turned and shuffled away, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty square. Lena stood there, staring at the spot where he had been. A strange sense of urgency washed over her. The song. The melody that had been lost to time. It called to her, beckoning her to uncover its secrets. She could not resist. As she turned to leave the square, the wind shifted, carrying with it a single note. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A single, haunting note that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth itself. Lena closed her eyes, listening to it as it danced on the edge of her consciousness. The song was alive, and it was waiting for her. The days that followed Lena's meeting with Ezra were filled with an unsettling quiet. Marrowvale, though a picturesque village by all appearances, was anything but peaceful. There was an undercurrent of something ancient, something forgotten, weaving through the cobbled streets and the ivy-covered walls. Every morning, Lena wandered through the village, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching her, something older than the trees, older than the earth itself. It was on the third morning, as the sun hung low over the village, casting long shadows across the buildings, that Lena found the house. She had never seen it before, though it had clearly stood for as long as the village itself. It was at the edge of Marrowvale, tucked behind a row of crooked, forgotten houses that no one ever seemed to visit. The house was tall, its windows dark and empty, its walls weathered with age. Vines crept up its sides, their tendrils curling like fingers reaching for the sky. The door, heavy and blackened by time, was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Lena hesitated. Something about the place felt off. It was as though it had been waiting for her, the same way the song had been. She pushed the door open, its hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the silence that filled the house was oppressive, as if it had not been touched by human presence in years, decades, perhaps. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she made her way through the dark, narrow hallway. She ran her fingers along the walls, feeling the cold stone beneath her skin. In the distance, she could hear the faintest echo, like a whisper, drifting through the house. It was not the sound of a voice, but of something deeper, something that vibrated in the very marrow of her bones. She followed the sound, instinctively, as though her body knew where it was leading her, even if her mind didn't. It took her to a small room at the back of the house, its door barely hanging on its hinges. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and strange trinkets. But it was the piano that caught her attention. It was an antique, its wood darkened with age, and yet it seemed oddly well kept. The keys were slightly yellowed, but not broken, and the lid, though dusty, was intact. The strange thing, however, was the sheet music that lay spread across the piano. It was old, too, its edges curled and brittle with age. But what truly captivated her were the notes on the paper, faint and incomplete, as though someone had begun writing a song and then stopped, leaving the melody unfinished. Lena reached out to touch the music, her fingers brushing against the paper. As soon as her skin made contact, the air around her seemed to shift, as though the room itself was breathing. The faint echo grew louder, a chorus of whispers intertwining with the air. She could hear it now, more clearly than ever before, the melody that had been lost to time, the one Ezra had spoken of. It was not just a song. It was a call. She felt it in her chest, the music vibrating inside her, the notes pulling her closer. The house, the song, they were all connected. And for the first time, Lena understood what Ezra had meant. The song was never meant to be written. It was meant to be felt. But as the last note of the melody played in her mind, the door behind her slammed shut. The room went still. The music that had been swirling around her moments before, its ghostly whispers now gone, left nothing but a silence so thick it felt like a tangible presence. Lena's heart raced in her chest, her breath shallow as she turned to face the door. It had shut with such force that the air had been knocked from her lungs, and the heavy thud of it echoed in her ears. She rushed to the door, her hands trembling as they grasped the cold, metal handle. The door didn't budge. She pulled harder, then pushed, but it was locked tight, as if something unseen had sealed it from the other side. Panic gnawed at her. She had to get out. The house felt oppressive now, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. In the silence, a thought began to form, one that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The song. She had heard it, the fragments of it, the whispers, and it had led her here, to this house. But it wasn't the melody she had been seeking. No, it was the absence of it, the silence that followed, that had pulled her in. Lena stepped back, her eyes scanning the room, looking for some other way out. But there was nothing, only the piano, the scattered sheet music, and the deep shadows that lingered in the corners. It was then that she noticed something she hadn't before. On the wall, just above the piano, there was a portrait. The face in the painting was of a woman, pale and unblinking, her eyes eerily lifelike. It was hard to say why, but something about her gaze made Lena feel as though the woman was watching her, following her every move. Lena shuddered and tore her eyes away, turning back toward the music. There was something about the way it was laid out, something about the way it felt incomplete, that made her fingers itch to touch it again. Perhaps, she thought, if she could find the missing notes, if she could complete the song, it would allow her to leave. She moved toward the piano once more, and this time, she didn't hesitate. Her hands found the keys, her fingers lightly pressing down on them, just to hear the soft hum of sound. As she played, the notes felt almost foreign, like they were both familiar and unsettling at the same time. Each key she struck seemed to echo in the empty room, reverberating in her mind and sending shivers down her spine. And then, as if she had summoned it, the music began to form, slowly at first, like the stirring of a long-forgotten memory. It was a single note, a high, clear tone, followed by a deep, resonating hum, then another note, fragile and delicate. Lena continued to play, her hands moving of their own accord now, as though the melody was flowing through her and not from her. It was not her doing. No, it was something much older, much deeper, weaving itself through her mind, making her fingers dance across the keys. The more she played, the more the room seemed to change. The walls vibrated with the sound of the notes, the air thickening, heavy with the weight of 1,000 years. She could feel the house shifting, as though it were coming alive. The silence that had once filled the space had now become something else, a presence, a force, watching her, waiting for her to finish. And then, as her fingers reached for the final chord, the room fell into utter stillness. No sound. No whisper. Not even the hum of the piano. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she turned, desperately searching for an answer, any sign that she had done something right. Her eyes fell again on the portrait. The woman in the painting was no longer staring directly at her, but her lips had curled into a faint, unsettling smile. Lena took a step back. What had she done? Before she could gather her thoughts, the door behind her, the one that had been locked, creaked open. Lena hesitated. The door, which had just moments ago been sealed tight, now stood ajar, as though it had always been that way. The air in the room had shifted, colder now, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to make a choice. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her fingers trembled as she wiped them across her forehead, brushing away the cold sweat that had gathered there. She had completed the song, or so she thought. But the silence that followed, the complete absence of sound, had unsettled her more than anything. What had she awakened by playing those notes? And why had the door opened now? The faint light that had filtered through the cracks in the walls had dimmed, leaving the room in near darkness. The only illumination came from the flickering candle on the piano, casting erratic shadows across the room. Lena stepped forward, her feet shuffling softly across the wooden floor as she made her way toward the door. Each step felt like a question, a silent plea for understanding. She reached the threshold, but before crossing it, she glanced back one last time at the room she had just left, the room where the music had begun. The portrait of the woman still hung there, though now it seemed almost too still, too lifeless. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The woman in the painting had been watching her before, but now it was as though she were waiting for something. Shaking off the unease, Lena stepped into the hallway beyond the door. The narrow corridor stretched before her, dark and silent. There was an oppressive heaviness in the air, a weight that made her feel as though the walls were closing in once more. Her footsteps echoed unnervingly loud as she moved deeper into the house, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain. The hallway was lined with old portraits, their faces frozen in time, their eyes following her with an unsettling gaze. The deeper she walked, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as though the house itself was absorbing every sound, every breath, until there was nothing left but the oppressive weight of forgotten years. At the end of the corridor, a faint light flickered under a door that was slightly ajar, much like the one she had just passed through. Lena felt a strange pull, an invisible thread tugging at her, compelling her forward. Without thinking, she pushed open the door. The room she entered was unlike any she had seen before. It was not a living space, nor a place where anyone would ever sleep. It was a room of forgotten things. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with odd, dusty trinkets, old clocks, antique mirrors, and strange, half-finished sculptures. And there, in the center of the room, was an old wooden chest, its surface scarred with deep gouges, as though it had been opened many times over the centuries. Lena's gaze was drawn to the chest. It seemed to hum with a strange energy, vibrating with a silent power. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a magnetic pull that beckoned her closer. She approached it, her steps hesitant but determined. The air around the chest seemed to grow colder, and as she reached for the lid, her fingers brushed against something slick and wet. Pulling her hand away, Lena stared in disbelief. The chest, once dry and aged, was now damp, as though it had been exposed to something dark and unnatural. With trembling hands, she gripped the lid and, with a low creak, opened it. Inside was not what she expected. Rather than a jumble of old papers, relics, or forgotten mementos, the chest was filled with sheets of parchment, each one inscribed with faded musical notes. But these notes were not like any she had seen before. They were jagged, dissonant, as if they were fighting against one another, pulling the melody apart. Lena's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the missing piece, the rest of the song. She reached for one of the sheets, her fingers brushing the fragile paper. The moment she touched it, the entire room seemed to exhale, the air thickening around her. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and in the distance, she could hear the faintest sound, a hum, a whisper, the faintest hint of a melody once more. The song that was never written was not a piece of music meant to be played. It was something far older, something more dangerous. It was a key, and now, Lena had unlocked it. As the last note of the melody danced on the edge of her consciousness, the chest slammed shut with a violent force. The lights flickered, and in the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to shift, taking form. Lena spun around, panic seizing her chest. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was the woman from the portrait. Lena's heart froze as the figure emerged from the shadows. The woman from the portrait, her pale face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, stepped forward with a slow, deliberate grace. Her eyes, those haunting, unblinking eyes, were now fixed on Lena, as though she had been waiting for this very moment for centuries. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. She backed away instinctively, but the air in the room seemed to thicken around her, pushing her forward as though she were being pulled into the very depths of the house itself. The figure moved closer, her feet barely touching the ground, her presence both ethereal and terrifying. "You shouldn't have played the song." The woman's voice was a soft whisper, like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind, yet it seemed to reverberate in the very core of Lena's being. The words echoed through the room, carrying a weight far beyond their softness. Lena's legs felt as though they had turned to stone. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her throat felt dry, constricted, as though the house itself was choking her. She wanted to flee, to turn and run, but the room felt like a prison, each step she took drawing her further into its web. "Why?" Lena managed to whisper, her voice barely audible, her eyes locked on the woman who now stood before her, her presence overwhelming. "What is this place? Why does it feel so wrong?" The woman's smile was almost imperceptible, a curl of her lips that barely moved. "This house is a place of lost things," she said, her tone detached, as though she were speaking of something as ordinary as the weather. "It is a place where time has stopped, where the music that was never written lingers, unfinished, waiting for someone to give it form." Lena's heart thudded in her chest as the realization hit her like a crashing wave. She understood now. The song had been a trap, a song that no one was meant to finish. It was a song that held the power to awaken something ancient, something terrible, and it had been waiting for someone to play it. "Who are you?" Lena gasped, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The woman's eyes softened for a fleeting moment, a ghost of sadness flickering across her pale face. "I am the one who once sang the song," she said quietly. "I am the voice that was lost. And you, child, have brought it back. You have unlocked something that should have remained buried." Lena took a step back, her pulse racing. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The woman's smile grew, but it was not one of comfort. It was cold, distant, as if she had long ago surrendered to the darkness that now surrounded them both. "Now, you must finish what you've started." Before Lena could respond, the room around them seemed to shift, the walls warping, the very air pulsing with a strange energy. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, the faintest hum vibrating through the wood. The shadows in the corners of the room stirred, twisting into dark shapes that flickered and danced like living things. The figure of the woman faded into the darkness, but her voice remained, reverberating through the house, through Lena's very soul. "Finish the song, and you will understand what it truly means." Lena stumbled backward, her mind racing. She had thought she had uncovered the truth by playing the piano, by unlocking the sheet music, but now she realized she had only scratched the surface. The song was not merely a melody. It was a doorway to something far darker, far older than she had ever imagined. As she stood in the center of the room, surrounded by shifting shadows, Lena knew one thing with undeniable certainty. There was no turning back now. The house had claimed her, and the song had claimed her. The final note was waiting, and it would not be denied. With trembling hands, Lena picked up the next sheet of parchment from the chest. The notes, jagged and dissonant, seemed to call to her, beckoning her forward, urging her to continue. For the first time since entering the house, Lena felt no fear. The fear had already been swallowed by the music, by the pull of the song that had become a part of her, echoing in her bones, in the very air around her. She was no longer an observer in this strange tale. She was a player. The last note was waiting. She could hear it clearly now, floating at the edge of her thoughts, like the softest whisper of a forgotten dream. The final note that would unlock everything. And she was ready to play it. Lena's fingers hovered over the final sheet of parchment, her eyes tracing the jagged, unfamiliar notes. The air around her seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing in on her, daring her to make the next move. It was as though the entire house, every room, every shadow, was waiting for her to finish what had been started so long ago. The shadows that had once flickered at the edges of the room now gathered around her, their shapes indistinct, swirling in the corners of her vision. The light from the flickering candle on the piano seemed to dim, casting long, erratic shadows across the walls. But there was something different now, something shifting in the air. A presence. It was as though the house itself had come alive, its pulse quickening in time with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Lena took a deep breath, her mind whirling with questions that had no answers. What was this song? What had it summoned? And who was the woman in the portrait? As her fingers finally brushed against the keys of the piano, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The first note rang out, crisp and clear, but it was not the sound of a melody. No, it was the sound of a question. An invitation. She played again, the second note trembling beneath her touch, hanging in the air like a fragile thing. With each note that followed, the music grew more intense, more urgent. The rhythm of it wrapped around her like a tightening noose, pulling her deeper into the heart of the song. But with the third note, something changed. The walls seemed to breathe, and the shadows that had once danced now stood still, watching her. Their presence felt heavier now, more tangible, as though they were closing in, encircling her. The pulse of the house quickened, each thrum of energy matching the beat of her heart. The song was no longer a melody. It was a force, something older than time itself, something that had been waiting, watching, for the one who would finish it. Lena's hand shook as she reached for the final note, the jagged key that would complete the song. Her breath caught in her throat as she pressed down on it. A deafening silence followed. The room went still, as if time itself had stopped. And then, the sound. It was not a note, but a roar, a deep, guttural, inhuman sound that filled the room, the house, the very earth beneath her feet. The air itself seemed to tremble with the force of it, vibrating so violently that the floorboards cracked and groaned beneath her. The shadows stretched and writhed, distorting into shapes that were both too large and too small, twisting into forms that were never meant to be seen. Lena's heart thudded in her chest as the darkness around her pressed in, pressing against her skin, her bones, her soul. The house was alive with something ancient, something hungry, something that had been awakened by the music she had played. A voice, the voice, rose from the depths of the house, a low, thrumming hum that seemed to echo through every corner, every crack. It was the voice of the woman from the portrait, but distorted, stretched thin by the centuries. The song had changed her. It had consumed her, as it was now consuming Lena. "You have completed it," the voice said, but it was not her voice anymore. It was a chorus, 1,000 voices woven together, rising from the very walls. The sound of it was both beautiful and terrifying, as if the world itself was singing, but with the grief of ages. Lena tried to speak, but no words came. Her throat tightened, suffocated by the weight of the sound, the weight of the house. "You have opened the door," the voice whispered, a mournful sadness seeping through the words. "And now, there is no escape." The shadows seemed to move closer, folding in on themselves, twisting, stretching. Lena could feel the pull of them, drawing her in, filling the air with a suffocating darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed the woman before her, and the others before her. She had finished the song. The final note had opened a door that had been waiting for centuries. A door that led into the heart of the house, into the heart of the song itself. And now, the music had no end. It would continue, forever, echoing through the halls of Marrowvale, through the world, through time itself. But Lena felt the darkness closing around her, felt the pull of it wrapping around her heart. The last thing she heard, before the shadows consumed her completely, was the final, hollow echo of the song, a song that was never meant to be completed. And in that moment, she knew the truth. There would be no end. The darkness enveloped Lena, swallowing her whole. It pressed in on her from all sides, suffocating her, pulling her into the depths of the house, into the very core of the song. The house had claimed her, as it had done to so many others before her, its cold fingers wrapping around her soul. The music echoed in her mind, but it was no longer the melody she had once played. It was something else now, a deafening, chaotic symphony of despair, a song that could never end. Lena's body felt heavy, her limbs unresponsive, as though she was sinking into something ancient and unknowable. The shadows crawled over her skin, burrowing into her, as if they were part of her now, fused together, entwined in a dance of forgotten time. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. Only the relentless, endless hum of the music filled her mind, filling every crevice of her being. But then, as though the house itself had exhaled, a single, clear note pierced through the chaos. It was a soft sound, almost imperceptible, like a whisper from the deepest recesses of her consciousness. The song had never truly ended. It had only changed. Lena's heart jolted in her chest as the world around her shifted. The shadows, which had once seemed like all-consuming darkness, began to dissipate. The oppressive weight of the house lightened, as if the very walls had begun to breathe again, exhaling the suffocating air that had held her captive. Her limbs, once heavy as stone, slowly regained feeling, and she found herself standing in the very heart of the house. But it wasn't the house she had come to know. The oppressive darkness had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness, a calmness that settled over everything like a blanket. Lena's gaze drifted upward. The woman from the portrait stood before her, but she was not the same. The eyes that had once been empty, unblinking, now gleamed with an unsettling awareness. The pale skin, once lifeless, now shimmered in the soft glow of the candlelight. Her lips parted, revealing a faint, knowing smile. "You've done it," the woman's voice echoed, but this time it was different. It was not hollow or distant. It was clear, full of life, and full of something else. Something relieved. "You've freed us." Lena's mind raced, the remnants of the music still vibrating through her chest. "Freed? But what do you mean? What have I done?" The woman tilted her head, her gaze softening. "When you played the final note, you did not merely finish the song. You unlocked a truth. The house, it was never meant to trap. It was meant to remember. The song, Lena, it was a record of those who had been forgotten, those who had once lived here and lost their way. The silence that followed, it wasn't emptiness. It was their voices, waiting to be heard once more." Lena blinked, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the revelation. "The house remembers," she whispered, her voice trembling. The woman nodded. Yes. The song was never just a melody. It was a call, a plea to those who had once been lost in time. You finished it, but in doing so, you didn't complete it in the way you thought. You set us free from the silence. You allowed us to speak again. And now the song has no end, because it has already returned to where it belongs. Lena's head spun. The music, the silence, the shadows, it was all a cycle, a loop. The house had not been a prison. It had been a waiting place. A place for the lost, for the forgotten, to find their way back, to remember themselves. "You are not the first to come here, Lena," the woman continued, her voice soft but strong. "But you are the first to understand. The others, they were trapped by their own fears. But you completed the song, not with your hands, but with your heart. You listened. You understood." Lena's breath caught in her throat. "So, this house, this song, this music, it's all alive." The woman smiled again, but this time it was not unsettling. It was peaceful, almost knowing. "It always has been. The house is a living memory, a song that remembers every person, every soul that has ever passed through. And now, Lena, you are part of it. Not as a prisoner, but as a keeper of its song." The shadows that had once surrounded her now seemed to shimmer with a soft light. The house, the music, everything began to transform, to shift from something dark and suffocating into something beautiful. The walls seemed to stretch open, revealing vast, infinite skies beyond. It was no longer a place of confinement. It was a gateway, a doorway between realms, between the living and the lost. And then, for the first time since she had entered the house, Lena felt a presence beside her, a warmth, a steadying force. She turned, and before her stood the woman, her face now bathed in a gentle glow. "Welcome home, Lena," the woman said, her voice warm, full of life. And as Lena looked around, she realized that the house, the song, had not consumed her. It had freed her. She had not been pulled into darkness, but had been given the gift of seeing, of understanding, of becoming a part of something far greater than herself. Lena reached out, her fingers brushing the air, and as she did, the music, the song, echoed once more, but this time, it wasn't a song of sorrow. It was a song of belonging. And in that moment, Lena understood. The song would never be finished, because it was always meant to play on, forever, across time, through memories, through those who would listen. She was no longer just a part of the house. She was its song. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts. If you're craving more mysteries, thrillers, and spine-chilling tales, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss out on the next chapter. The darkness is always waiting, and the next story could be just around the corner. See you in the next one, if you dare.